I guess then we'll get started with the introductions, and then we'll move on to the format of the webinar and take it from there.
Sounds great.
So my name is Jennifer Scanlon, and I'm one co-organizer. My co-moderator is Miranda Lash. Miranda is Curator of Contemporary Art at the Speed Art Museum, where she began working in August 2014. At the Speed, she's overseeing new commissions for the upcoming Elizabeth Key and Frederick Cary Pressman Art Park, and organizing the reinstallation of the first collection for the new building, both of which are scheduled to open in April 2016. Before she started at Speed, she was the curator of modern and contemporary at the New Orleans Museum of Art, where she organized the now traveling retrospective exhibition, Melchin Rematch. And she's on the board of Pelican Bomb, the advisory board for Parse New Orleans, and is a member of the Commission on Public Art for the City of Louisville. One of our panelists is Deborah Cullen. Hello, Deborah. Welcome. Deborah is the Director and Chief Curator of the Miriam and Ira D. Wallach Art Gallery at the Columbia University, and she's leading the gallery's expansion and re-envisioning into a new Renzo Piano Building Workshop Art Center on the rising Manhattanville campus at 125th and Broadway, which is also scheduled to open in 2016. Previously, Cullen served at El Museo del Barrio in New York for over 15 years. She served on the board of AAMC and the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, and she served on the steering committee for the Contemporary Curators as a governor for the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop and on several advisory councils. Additionally, she was a executor and is currently a trustee for the estate of Robert Blackburn. And then we have, as our final panelist, Emily Neff, who is our own AAMC president, which has been since May 2013. She was most recently Weiler Dean and Bill Saxon Director and Chief Curator of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. She was the founding curator of American Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where she helped the trustees and the institution's leadership establish a significant presence for the museum in the field of American art. She grew the museum's collections by more than 30% and built a dynamic patron support group, organized more than 20 exhibitions at the museum, coordinated 14 traveling shows from other institutions. She's currently on the advisory boards of the Smithsonian American Art Journal and the Clifford Still Museum. I am honored to be leading this great company. I'm an independent curator based out of New York. Before I went solo, I was at the Museum of Arts and Design for 12 years, and I'm still working on projects with them. I have another show opening with them next spring. And I'm on the board of Art Table, where I'm the vice president for programs. So we have a lot of experience among this group on both the curatorial institutional side of the board and serving on boards ourselves. The way we're going to organize this particular webinar, we'll start with Miranda, who is going to give a 10-minute introduction to what we're calling Board 101, some of the terms and basics for boards. We're going to follow that. I'll be talking with Deborah Cullen more about her experience on both sides of the board for about 20 minutes. Miranda's going to have a conversation with Emily for another 20 minutes of some of the same questions, a dialogue there. And the final 10 minutes or so of that period, we're going to have what we call the lightning round, where we've come up with different situations. It's also a sort of a specific board situations that we thought we'd present to the panelists and hear how you would respond in specific situations. And we wanted to leave a lot of time at the end for any of the questions that participants had. So please, as we're working with, as you're listening to the webinar, let us know if you have questions or comments or compliments. Maybe you just like to say nice things. We're open to those as well. You can send those to us, and we will read them at the end anonymously. So let's start then with Miranda and the brief introduction to boards, which you should be able to see on your screens already.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to be here. Let's see. I'm going to switch over to show my presentation, and I'm going to shrink the camera. All right, so hopefully you can all see the presentation here. I wanted to put this together as someone who's dealt with boards, knowing them as the stewards of the museum, stewards of the organization. But I've been in attendance in board meetings and maybe have heard terms that have been used in different contexts. So I thought it'd be helpful to sort of go through the technical terms that you might hear in a board meeting and in relationship to a board. So, and I want to preface this by saying I'm really going to be dealing specifically with nonprofit boards, meaning boards where you do not have, where there is no compensation for being on the board, as opposed to, say, a for-profit board where you do receive compensation. So focusing mostly on, say, for example, boards for an art museum or boards for a otherwise nonprofit art organization. So let's begin. I wanted to share the sources that I looked at for finding these terms. I found it really helpful to visit the Association of Art Museum Directors website, AAMD. They have free documents available as PDF downloads, one of which is Professional Practices in Art Museums, another of which is Good Governance and Nonprofit Integrity. And those can be found at www.aamd.org. Another very helpful source is Board Source, which Jennifer Scanlon pointed out to me. It's a great source for downloading free PDFs, again, just sort of drilling down into specific terms related to boards. You can have a free membership and download a lot of PDFs free of charge. If you want more in-depth literature, they do charge for that, but if you just like the quick and dirty basics, I do recommend it as a place to start. So a lot of the language that you'll see comes from these various sources. So first, what does a board do? A board is the agency of governance for a museum, and that means they adopt and update the organization's mission, bylaws, and policies. Together with the director, the board sets the direction of the organization, develops its long-range plan, and secures the resources needed to fulfill its mission, including fundraising. The board has a fiduciary responsibility for the organization's resources, which at a museum includes the collections, physical plant, assets, and staff. And I'll touch a bit on fiduciary responsibility in a bit. The board also appoints the director, to whom it delegates the responsibility for day-to-day operations, to be the chief executive officer. And it should be noted that the chief executive is the only staff member under the direct supervision of the board. So next, who is on a board? Nowadays, museum directors desire a diverse range of board members who as a group can offer the following skills: financial management, legal counsel, strong demonstrations of personal philanthropy, including providing and seeking out donations, in-kind services and works of art. An increasingly important one is access to new and underserved communities, strong nonprofit management experience, and a historical understanding of the museum and long-term relationships with the institution, which is why it can be invaluable at times to have board members who have really known an institution for a long period of time. Next, board positions. And this is just a very brief overview, but the board chair, that's certainly where a lot of the power lies. A board chair oversees the board and executive committee meetings. An executive committee is sort of a leadership subgroup of the board. Not all boards have them, but larger boards tend to. The board chair appoints all committee chairs, and with the chief executive recommends those who will serve on committees. They also oversee searches for the new chief executive. So, for example, when there's a change in directorship at a museum. The board vice chair serves on the executive committee if one exists, and is able to perform the duties of the board chair in the chair's absence. Next, the board secretary ensures the safety and accuracy of all board records and reviews board minutes, provides notice of meetings of the board and or of a committee, and they assume the responsibilities of the chair in the absence of the board chair, chair-elect, and vice chair. The board treasurer is an important position. They serve as chair of the finance committee if one exists. They ensure that appropriate financial reports are made available to the board on a timely basis. They present the annual budget to the board for approval. They review the annual audit, and they answer board members' questions about the audit. So those are just some of the basics. Not all positions on a board allow for voting. There's such thing as non-voting positions. So one question that came up in our discussions is, what is the difference between a trustee versus a governor? And I should begin by emphasizing I do think it varies institution to institution. In some organizations, the Board of Governors, the Board of Directors, or the Board of Trustees all essentially describe the same governing body of a nonprofit. However, in others, there is a distinction between Board of Trustees who all vote and a Board of Governors who do not. So for the Speed Art Museum is one, for example, where we have a non-voting Board of Governors. A non-voting position can be offered to someone so that they can be considered as a future voting board member, so it's sort of a tryout position. It can also be a way of continuing the involvement of former board members who have rotated off, but, for example, still want to be involved in your institution. Next, another type of non-voting position is being on an advisory council or an advisory board. In that case, individuals have been chosen based off their expertise to advise the board on specific matters. This actually comes up a lot for curators. I think it's not uncommon for curators to have to serve in advisory positions. Another term that's helpful to know is ex officio member, which the term is based on the Latin phrase from the office. It's a position given to someone by virtue of their office or a position in another organization. So, for example, a museum may ask the dean of a local university to serve in an ex officio position. Because it's based off their current office or position, when an ex officio member ceases to hold that office, their membership on the board terminates automatically. And it really depends on the bylaws of different institutions whether an ex officio can vote. Some can and some cannot, depending on the bylaws. Next, what are bylaws? The most fascinating part of all board proceedings. Bylaws are the legally binding rules that outline how a nonprofit will operate. They are used to guide the board's actions and decisions, and they are helpful in preventing or resolving conflict and disagreements. The board creates bylaws when the organization is established. States have different statutes that apply to bylaws. Some states dictate specific provisions, while other states give more general guidelines. And I should say, when an organization is putting together bylaws, it's a great idea and often done to seek legal counsel on the viability of these bylaws. Bylaws are not static, and the board should review them regularly. They should accurately reflect how the organization works and remains relevant. This requires amending the bylaws periodically. And in some cases, some organizations appoint a task force to review the bylaws and make suggestions for revision to the whole board. So, what should be included in bylaws? The name and location of the organization, statement of purpose, election, roles, and terms of board members and officers, membership issues, meeting guidelines, board structure, compensation and indemnification of board members, the role of the chief executive, how to amend the bylaws, and the dissolution of the organization, should that come to pass. Next, fiduciary responsibility. This is an important one to know about because this is one of the chief responsibilities of being on a board. One of the main responsibilities of board members is to maintain financial accountability of their organization. Therefore, board members must exercise due diligence to oversee that the organization is well managed and that its financial situation remains sound. This can include annual budget review, securing necessary funding, examining financial statements regularly, comparing actual figures to projected ones, asking questions such as, are our expenses appropriate, and asking if there are appropriate checks and balances to prevent errors, fraud, and abuse, such as in signing checks, handling cash, approving expenses, and outlining the parameters for credit card usage. Give-get is a term you might hear a lot when it comes to joining a board or as far as requirements for board members. Boards often require a minimum amount of charitable support from all board members. A give-get is a way to define the minimum financial contribution from each board member. A board member can either give the required amount or get, i.e. fundraise, the equivalent. But it should be said that the philosophy of give, get, or get off should be tempered with an understanding of the diverse resources a board member can contribute, and that a board's first duty is that of good governance. Next, committees. These are really the workings, mechanics of the board. Most boards consider committees an essential part of the board structure. Traditionally, the bylaws define the standing committees and their roles. The most common standing committees in museums are executive, finance, collections, and development. In addition, boards can form ad hoc committees or task forces that are formed to carry out a specific task. A committee member must understand that it does not make decisions. Rather, committees advise and recommend decisions to the full board. Conflict of interest. This is where things get tricky. A conflict of interest is when a board member or a candidate has a major obstacle to fulfilling the duty of loyalty, one of the main legal obligations of being on a board. Because board members often have numerous professional and personal affiliations, it is necessary that the board has a policy for dealing with conflicts of interest that include, for example, a statement of commitment signed by board members and a disclosure form that every board member signs annually after listing all financial, professional, and other relevant affiliations that might affect their decision-making during the coming year. Each board member should bring up any unexpected conflicts of interest that may arise during deliberations. If necessary, they will recuse themselves or leave the room. And last but not least, board insurance, just in case something goes wrong. Board insurance is also known as Directors and Officers Liability Insurance, or D&O. It protects past, present, and future directors and board members from damages resulting from alleged or actual wrongful acts that they may have committed in their positions. Since a director or officer or board member can sometimes be held responsible for the acts of organizations, most directors and officers will want to be covered rather than risk their personal assets. And it should be noted that the vast majority of claims filed against D&O policies are related to wrongful termination, harassment, or discrimination. So, for example, because a board approves the personnel policies of an organization, an employee might argue that the termination policies were not followed correctly, and therefore they're suing the organization. So that was a very quick sketch of basic terms, and now we're going to get into more practical applications. So I'll open it up to the rest of the group.
Thanks, Miranda.
No problem.
Okay. So I'm going to start off by talking to Deborah Cullen about some of her experiences. This webinar is called Both Sides of the Board. So we'll be talking first about being on a board, and then about working as a curator or director with the board of whatever institution you're working for. So Deborah, can you talk about which boards you've served on and why you chose to serve on those boards?
Sure. Probably the earliest board that I was invited to serve on was for Robert Blackburn's printmaking workshop, where I had worked for more than 10 years, since the 1980s, and sometime in the mid-1990s, I had stopped serving for them in any paid capacity, and there were a number of important decisions that were coming up that they wanted me to be involved in, specifically to do with a print collection related to the printmaking workshop that I was the resident expert on. So they invited me to be part of the board, and I was very familiar with the board members and the artist director, Robert Blackburn, and was, grateful and honored to be invited and wanting to help serve. Around the same time, I also was involved with a number of artists from a group in Los Angeles called the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, that at that point was primarily doing project-based projects related to the AIDS pandemic and some publishing, and I was excited also to serve alongside of them. That was a board that I was less involved with at the time because it was based in Los Angeles, and the printmaking workshop board took a lot of my time, and I was glad to give it because the director was getting old, and he needed to make a number of decisions with the help of his advisors about the future of the workshop and the print collection.
So were these boards, it sounds like at least the printmaking was one that they offered to you because you were already involved, or were any of these boards that you actively sought to be a part of?
No, I didn't actively seek to be part of it, but it became sort of a natural result of my involvement anyway.
And did they, inform your curatorial practice at all? Was that helpful to you being part of those boards, or was it just a matter of being active in something that you really felt close to as an organization?
Well, they were both really interesting in different capacities. One, the printmaking workshop really opened my eyes to a lot of the issues around the precariousness of not-for-profit spaces. What we could call founder syndrome, and the decision-making that needs to take place when an organization goes from being something that the founder has cherished and nurtured for decades and then needs to turn over for its future, and maybe needs to change the way it operates a little bit to make it relevant and sustaining for its future. And the other board was more was sort of less time consuming and more about making an annual donation and supporting with 2 meetings a year that were called in, sort of decision making processes. So in both cases it was interesting for me because I got to learn about how some of these different decisions are made, and really opened my eyes to things that would later become very important to my curatorial practice.
Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about your work as a trustee at this point, and how that may be similar to and different from being on the board of an organization. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the work with the printmaking workshop segued from being on a board of trustees with fiduciary responsibility for several years until the workshop, seeing the workshop through a negotiation with the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, where it became a program of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, where it is now, so sort of working on all that legal paperwork and documentation to take something from an active 501c3 to a program of another organization, which was complex and fascinating. And then just by working with the artist for so long, eventually working with him on his will, and now serving as an executor of his estate and a trustee of his estate. So it all sort of was a natural progression of something that I was already involved in. But the issues involved in each of those things was an incredible learning experience for me, and something that I felt grateful to be involved in and be able to help. It was at times very, very time consuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's segue right to that question. In terms of how do you manage when you have, as all curators do, a more than full-time job, and you're in addition involved with some other organizations? How can you deal with those sorts of time management questions? How have you done that?
Well, for me, I wouldn't want to be involved with a board that I didn't want to dedicate a certain amount of time to. In this case, it was something very near and dear to my heart from the 1980s. So it made sense for me to contribute a lot of time. And in fact, I'm still working with the estate and a board of governors, which is non-fiduciary, for the printmaking workshop program at the Elizabeth Foundation, which is a minimal amount of time. It's just something that I felt the responsibility and the inclination to do. And for me, it was, as I said, an incredible learning experience.
Okay. Were there any boards that you've actively pursued membership on because the organization interested you? Or has it been a question of
with AAMC, for example, I was there in the beginning when the organization was formed, and immediately became somewhat involved in some committees, and that just led to an invitation to be on the board. The same with the Contemporary Curators group, which doesn't have an official board. It's more like a loose steering committee, and there's no fiduciary responsibility or meetings or bylaws or anything. It's much more of a loose group, but that was an invitation just from being involved from the beginning. So I think something that if you're involved and you start making it known that you care and you want to spend time, then sometimes the invitation comes from that.
Mm-hmm. So that would be your advice. And this, I should mention to everyone who's listening, that the idea for this webinar, in fact, came from a conversation with Deborah, who noticed that she was talking to members of a different organization, if I'm not mistaken, that were interested in finding out how you do become a board member. And it sounds like maybe starting with committee membership is one way to, one route to becoming more involved at that level.
I think in some of the professional organizations. Another aspect is when you're the involvement that you have with the board of your own organization, which is a different, it's the other side of the board. But I also had been very, very involved with the board at El Museo del Barrio, the board of trustees there, leading a committee and sitting at the general board meetings as the head of the curatorial department. So I just had a lot of experience with boards of a certain type.
Great, and you've provided me with an excellent segue to the second half, the other side of the board, and that is your experiences working as a curator, or your experience now working with boards in various capacities.
Well, currently at Columbia University, there's a board of trustees of the entire university, which I am not involved at all. And for the moment, it's a nice relief in a certain way. I do have an advisory board that oversees the gallery, and I do lead and I'm involved with them. At El Museo, where I was for 15 and a half years prior to coming to Columbia 2 years ago, when I became the head of the curatorial department in 2004, I then ran the Programs and Acquisitions Committee meetings, which met 4 times a year in advance of the board meeting, and then reported up to the full board, and was usually asked to attend nearly all of the board meetings to report or make presentations. So that was a pretty close and involved board relationship, sometimes more than one would like even.
So let's dig into that a little bit. Tell us about how that, were there any situations you'd want to share in which you felt that it was a little bit too involved?
Because it was such a small organization, the board was very, very involved with the staff at all levels. Because I was there through 2 different directorships, including 2 different search periods, when there is no director, it sort of becomes a little more difficult to manage the board, even if there's an interim director. And because I had been there for so very, very long and had strong relationships with a number of the board members, I would have to say, and this has been my experience on a number of boards, that they would sometimes just bypass the director or interim director and call directly to the staff.
And what do you do, or what would be your advice for another curator about dealing with that situation? Did you have strategies?
I think as much as possible, if you can manage by copying in your director or speaking with them, or just keeping them in the loop of what's going on even after the fact, because that's the proper way. The contact is supposed to be channeled is through your director. But there have been times that it's also been very, very useful to have close and direct relationships to board members. So it's not all bad, but it should always be copied to the director.
What are can you give us some examples of the times it's been good to develop those relationships?
Sure. In preparation for committee meetings, I could call upon certain members and ask them to, be particularly supportive of a project that I knew was going to be difficult to put through, or to speak out about the importance of doing certain things that the institution should and needed to do. I felt so you could rally their support.
And how did you go about developing those relationships with board members? For some of the perhaps junior curators who are watching, what would be some advice you could give on working well with board members?
I went to a fundraising meeting recently that a funder said, the most important thing to do is to be polite and return phone calls. It's kind of like obvious, but they're your board members, and they're spending a lot of time with your organization. So, I always attended to them immediately when I could, and within reason to do what they were asking or wanting to do. Sometimes I needed to fold in my director to let them know that it was what was happening.
Deborah's frozen on mine.
She's frozen on mine too.
Their own interests at stake. But other times they wanted to, I'm sorry?
Deborah, you were frozen for a second, so you just missed the last couple minutes. You're okay now.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sometimes, board members would want you to go see a show with them or go look at an artist or make a studio visit, and all that, of course, is perfectly normal if the director knows that you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Other times they would be very interested to have a particular artist be shown by the institution or be in the collection or other things, and that's sort of where you needed to temper their enthusiasm a little bit, although many times it was a perfectly fine suggestion. They just needed to always take things through the proper channels. So, I would just always say, of course, let's bring that up at the next meeting or the next, that it would become a public thing, a committee-run thing.
Would these kinds of relationships extend outside of work hours? Was that part of what? Sometimes.
Yeah, I think with a small institution like El Museo, there was a very active role on the part of the board, and the senior staff were very involved with the board. So, yeah, it would often be outside of work hours. Although I wouldn't socialize with them.
You wouldn't socialize with them?
No, I mean we would have meetings or appointments to go look at things or certain cocktails or events or auction attendance, but I wouldn't socialize privately with them outside of something that was for the institution.
So that would be a possible strategy for someone who is interested in drawing a line, would be making sure that your meetings with board members were involved around a work activity?
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think I'm going to, unless there's anything else, Deborah, that I didn't ask you, what you think would be helpful to people who are interested either in becoming part of a board or in dealing with board members.
No, I'm sure I'll jump back in as things come up as we go forward.
All right, great. I'll turn this over to Miranda and Emily then to focus on some of the same questions.
Great, thanks very much. Emily, thank you so much for being a part of this. I think I'm going to begin with a very similar question to Jennifer, in the sense of if you could start by describing which boards you've done and how you chose to be involved in them.
Well, first of all, I love working with boards and being on boards. I have found it to be a place in which I've learned a great deal, not only about museums and nonprofits, but also a lot about human nature, which always comes in handy as both a curator and a director. I would say that unlike Deb, I have not been on a board in which I had a fiduciary responsibility, so always in a capacity as a kind of advisor. And, one exception would, of course, be the AAMC, where I've been on the board for some time, and so I do make a yearly donation to be a part of the leadership circle. No one, asked me in particular or said that it was expected, but I think it's expected at that level that you do what you can, so gladly I did so. I would say that in terms of involvement, I didn't actively seek involvement. Usually these things come to you, or at least that has been my experience. And I think that what I've done is, before accepting the invitation, which is always an honor and always flattering, is to really spell out what are the commitments. And what is your role? The last thing I would want to do is be dead weight on someone's board. So getting a clear understanding of what the expectations are from the people issuing the invitation. And some of this is kind of flat-footed and nuts and bolts, but as a curator, director, you're working 24/7 anyway. And what you do is out of advocacy for the field. And so to have it spelled out that one board that I'm involved in, it's really just 2 times a year of intense work, 2 days physically in a different place, prep time before, during, and after. Then there are boards where, for example, AAMC, where there isn't a day that goes by that I'm not intimately involved, happily, with Judith and or Meredith. And so that's something that you kind of understand clearly from the beginning, that you will always set aside time in your day, at any time of day, to take some of those routine matters. And it may only be 10 minutes of your time. And you do need to drop it and whatever you're doing and be able to do that. And I hope Judith is not snickering in the background, remembering times where it wasn't, where I didn't automatically drop something. But by and large, that gives you an idea. Another one that's really just once a year, it's almost like it's a brainstorming session, bringing people together, thinking about programming for another institution. How would you go about it? And so, it's not a huge time commitment. And, like Deb, I find that working in these different, exercises, plain incising a different part of your brain automatically has an effect on your curatorial practice or your director practice. It just expands your horizons. You see human nature at work. You have the privilege of hearing great ideas from a variety of great people of different backgrounds, experiences, fields, and so forth. And so, it's a really, I see it more as a privilege than a burden. Although there are times when you do feel like, oh my gosh, why did I agree to do that? But I think the larger point is making sure ahead of time that you have a clear understanding of what it's expected. Of course, you may not know that. I mean, it sounds like with Deb's or hers sort of naturally evolved over time. Had she asked that question, not have known that or they would not have known that it would end up being an executor and so on and so forth. So you're not always going to know the answer to that question, but I think getting it out there is certainly helpful. And it also makes the other person on the other side of the phone or the other invitation understand that you do have a more than full-time job, that you're utterly dedicated to helping, but there could be a limit to what you're able to do.
Right. So say you're debating whether to join a board, or maybe you're already on a board and the commitments are evolving. As a general philosophy, would you say, is it better to say, okay, I'm in, and I'm going to do it what I can, I'll do my best, or is it better to say, I don't think I can do this all the way 100% all the time, therefore I should withdraw?
Well, I think I generally in the past have sent it back to them and to say, this year, and this is particularly, and I hope this will be helpful to people out there in virtual world who are AAMC members and interested in becoming involved in the board. Certainly we welcome that kind of involvement, and that usually happens through going through the committee, working on committees. But it's totally fine to say, this year, I'm opening a major exhibition and writing a major catalog. This is a really bad year for me. But if you, could still use my help, then next year I could really dedicate a lot of time to whatever project it is that you want. But I usually throw it back at them because it gives you a little bit of clarity too for why they're asking you in particular. Is there something special that you bring to the table? In which case then you can sort of, say, well, look, I really have limited time this year, but it sounds like what you really need is X, Y, Z. If I could give you an hour a month, which is really all I can afford this year because of X, Y, and Z projects I'm doing, I am more than happy to do that. So there's a little bit of negotiating in that regard. And as long as it's an open and honest and direct conversation about time commitments, you're good. And I would think that most people would really enjoy working on a board and, as I said, sort of expanding your experiences and knowledge base in that way.
Absolutely. Well, on the subject of, for, AAMC, I would use that as a segue to talking about committees. Because there are a number of committees as part of AAMC. How would you suggest, say, either deciding what committee might be best for you, or if you're asked to join a committee, determining whether that committee is the right fit?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to go about it. I mean, I would say that one of the best is obviously going to the annual conference that we have in May, because it's a tremendous networking opportunity. You do have an opportunity during the conference to visit at a meeting one of the committee meetings, and you put your name on a list with your email address, and you express your interest in those various committees. And in time, as we revamp the website, I think that you'll also be able to get a lot more information about what each committee is involved in. I think simple emails to either Judith, Meredith, or myself expressing interest, that's one way in which people have become involved. One of the things, when I was actually part of AAMC from the very beginning, and I remember that it felt a little bit frustrating because you volunteer to become involved, and you don't necessarily get that phone call right away. So you're thinking to yourself, wow, I volunteered, I'm willing to spend time, I'm willing to help with this, and nobody called me back. We're hoping to improve that. I think that is much less of a concern, but what I do want to point out to people is we do a lot of social engineering for these committees, and I know that may make some people feel uncomfortable. But for example, Jennifer, you're an independent curator. We have found that there are rising numbers of independent curators. Now we make sure that committees have that kind of representation on that committee. Or we hope to avoid a committee being all contemporary art or all Americanist, or you're wanting to have a variety of geographies, of size of institutions, field of expertise, junior curator, senior curator, independent curator. And so if people feel as if, well, wait, I really want to be on this committee, keep at it. You will have a chance. But also keep in mind that you cannot take any of it personally, because sometimes there may be a kind of a wait list of people who express interest for some time. And then, of course, that has to be balanced out with making sure that that committee is as representative as it can be of the AAMC. And we take that diversity of field, of everything into consideration. Now, the chairs and co-chairs of the committees are the ones who are mostly involved in that. And just as a matter of process and protocol, it is run by Judith and me, just to make sure that there is, that we feel like that committee is as good as we can get, because it's never going to be perfect, but as good as we can get in terms of representing the AAMC in its broad spectrum. I mean, a lot of people, when I first started, we didn't have any Canadian members, and now we have quite a few members from Canadian institutions. Well, that brings with it a certain, a different kind of constituency with different issues, and so, making sure that and hoping to invite their involvement, that kind of thing, those are very important in terms of determining these committees.
Right, great. Well, just to switch it slightly from being on a board to dealing with board members, something that I really paid attention to in your description was that dealing with the board is so much about understanding relationships and human nature, and getting a read on people. And and I remember in my discussions with you talk about how different people have different needs. Can you talk about different approaches that you might apply to dealing with board members?
Sure. I have been, I'm going to talk mostly here now about the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, because I was there for such a long time. 100 board members, so a very large board, a very large institution, a very complicated institution, and it's really the institution in which I was sort of raised in a way. And so that experience determined the way I look at boards. And that's because the culture of our board at the museum was, and I know this sounds corny, it really sounds corny, but it is true, is that there really was a kind of we are family ethic there. And that's the kind of thing that happens over a great deal of time and doesn't happen overnight. So I happen to think of it as an incredibly impressive, admirable board in terms of the broad spectrum of people involved, race, religion, diversity, relationship to Houston, relationship to the institution. So I had a really great experience there. And I would say we were, the way it worked with us is that and this has more to do with a former director, simply because he was there for the longest time when I was there, was that we would be called on the carpet if we were not involved with the board. In other words, he was someone who really believed that we should all be involved with our board members. Obviously, there are going to be a couple of exceptions. The chair of the board, which is usually a relationship that's exclusive to the director. And in those cases, if you needed something or you wanted to run something by the chair of the board, you just go to the director and say, do you mind asking so-and-so about this? Would you prefer I write a note? You want me to take care of it? You just sort of hash out those kinds of things with the director. But it was a very, very involved kind of relationship with the committee trustee members with whom I worked. And like Deb said, as long as you're keeping the director informed, and my sort of rule of thumb was I didn't want to bombard the director with too much information. So usually the question I asked, and West Houston is a fairly social place, is would I want my director to be at a cocktail party somewhere and hear XYZ from that person rather than me? So that was generally my rule of thumb. If it was not a big deal thing, I didn't worry about it. If it concerned me, I made sure that I sent an email or left a message or something like that, just so that he would always have that kind of information handy. And I think in terms of the way it worked with me is that I usually let the trustee member, take cues from them. So for example, and this is why I like to put it's Deb and me, because Deb works a lot with living artists. She's in the contemporary field. I have pre-1950 American art field, and so most of those trustees are over 50. Not that 50 is old, but older, and at least at my institution, a lot of them were multi-generational trustees, meaning that their mother, their grandmother, their father, their grandfather had been actively involved in the board. So their involvement was sort of involved with many other boards throughout Houston and throughout the country. And so I tended to take my cues from them. So one of my favorite people that I worked with, whom it was very much a business friendship. It was a little bit formal. I took my cues from her. So if we were traveling together and she wanted a nightcap, you bet. And we had a lot of fun, and it was terrific. But I didn't make demands on her. I kind of tried to suss out, do you like a personal phone call? Do you like an email? How often do you want to be in touch? And I would say we had a really great relationship, but it didn't really cross a line. And one of the reasons I've been careful, and Deb, I really appreciated what you said about this too, is that early on in my career, I was in the director's office, and the phone rang. He had to take it. I said, kind of motion, should I step outside? He said, no, stay here. And I heard him talk to a trustee and say, yes, I know that particular staff member often confuses himself or herself with a trustee, and I know that makes you feel uncomfortable. And so that to me kind of signaled, not that we just love that kind of upstairs, downstairs mentality, but in a formal organization where I worked, I don't think that would ever happen at maybe an alternative space, a kind of startup alternative space in which you probably would be good friends with the people who are on the board, even though you're staff. But I was part of a very kind of formal institution in that way. So I was very careful to keep those lines separate. However, if there's one, and this just happened last week from my former institution, he was in town, he and his wife said, let's go grab breakfast. He has my cell phone. I was delighted to see him. It was great. He and his family invite us to do things. I don't feel uncomfortable at all about that, but that's because he set the terms and the tone, and I never felt uncomfortable with it. I should be straight and say that if I ever felt uncomfortable, that would be a different issue. But I kind of, you have to take cues from your climate. And Houston is a very different place from, say, New York or some other city, and it happens to be in some ways a very southern city, and it is quite social, and so there is a kind of expectation that you do show up for those events that may not be associated with the museum directly.
Right. So just because we only have a couple minutes, but do you have any quick pointers for dealing with a difficult trustee or a prickly, say a trustee that you can't necessarily jettison because they have a legacy with the museum or there's a family history there?
Oh, those are my favorite kinds of challengers, right? Well, there is one in particular who that I can think of who is just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Tends to be, quite frankly, what we might describe as high maintenance. You've probably heard that description before. And, you don't need me to say this. We all know how busy we all are. And you're both, kind of getting in the zone to do research for a possible acquisition, or you're in the archives doing research for an exhibition project. And, it can be very hard to be pulled away and change gears and do something completely different. The way we addressed this was really organic, and this is why it's so great to have good relationships with your director that are kind of spelled out. In this instance, this person interacted with about 3 or 4 different curatorial areas at the museum. And so what we did this sounds more formal than it was very informal. We just kept in touch with one another. And so if I was really busy on a project, I might pop my head into so-and-so's office and say, look, so, this person really needs my time and I really can't give it. Can you take a turn? And that person would say, great, this is perfect timing, I'll handle it. Of course, you have to be ready when that person comes back to you and says, now it's my, and so in a way we kind of took turns and it ended up working really well. So that's where your colleagues can be really helpful to you because they're in the same boat that you are. And it's all of our jobs to make sure that that relationship with all board members is a good one. And so this is where taking your own personality out of the mix is a really good one because sometimes, a lot of it can be chemistry, and if so-and-so gets along better with so-and-so, go with it. And I think, too, because we've had 100 board members, no director can take care of 100, is the wrong word, but interact with 100 members at a high level. And that's where we as curators can really step up and say, look, I noticed that these people are needing a lot of your time. Would it be helpful if I organize thus and so activities with them so that you can focus on thus and so? And then if they say yes, great. If they say no, no problem. You offered, and you move on and do the best you can. But that's where I think, and I think Deb mentioned this too, having really, making sure your director knows what's going on, even if it's just a quick email, FYI, I was at, this exhibition with thus and so, and she said she really thought the museum should have this for the collection. Maybe we can talk about this later, or as Deb says, bring it to the committee at the next meeting. Just keeping those lines of communication open and filled with the information that they would need.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I think now we're going to transition to our lightning round, where
Before I wanted to transition, I just wanted to bring up one more thing as I was listening to both of your perspectives on being on boards and thinking about my experience. I've been a curator for less time, 15 years now. So one of the things I've appreciated about being on boards, as a curator, you often the road up is very slow. You can be at a junior level for many years. And being on a board of a smaller organization gives you opportunities for leadership experience that you may not get at work. And that's been huge for me personally, to be able to actually have the opportunity to be a committee chair and lead meetings and do things that I don't necessarily have the opportunities in the organizations I've worked for. Just wanted to add that as another plus that comes from being involved in the board of a different organization.
And I think that if I can just pop in real quick, Jennifer, and say that that's, you can't lead until you know how to manage, and there's a big difference. And I think the more involved you are, either on a board or involved, as Deb pointed out, and obviously I went to an institution where we all went to most of the board meetings, certainly not all, but most of them. It was a very open, very transparent kind of culture there. The more you learn about leadership and leading boards or leading groups of people, as you do with your committee work.
Great.
Can I say something very quickly about expectation of your time on a board?
Mm-hmm.
Every board that I've been involved with, or including seeing the board be rotating and changing at El Museo over the years, I was given a document, or we gave to prospective board members at El Museo, a binder actually, that said what their roles and responsibilities were, what the bylaws were, and what you as a board member were expected to do. So and that included how many times a year there were meetings, when they normally were held, what your donation was expected to be if there was one, or I would ask for that. So I think that really helps. Aside from that, you're going to be on a committee and do things that you are not outlined on that piece of paper at all. But that's sort of a basic understanding of what they expect from you.
And I've seen it both ways, Deb, and I have to say that I do like that approach where it's very clearly spelled out.
Absolutely.
I've also been involved with an institution where the leadership at that point really wanted to keep it rather loosey-goosey, with the idea that if people expect that you have to pay X amount per year to be involved, the give or get, that you may be insulting them by asking too little or too much. And so, as I said, I kind of think it's most helpful to board members to have it better spelled out, but I have been exposed to the other alternative where it's kept a little bit loosey-goosey.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add very briefly, my experience is sort of on the other end of the spectrum, where I've been asked to join two boards of very new organizations. Pelican Bomb is only, it's about 4 years old, and Parse is only a couple years old. And it's been a very steep learning curve as far as learning. It's far more than just, I like this organization and they're great. And actually feeling like, well, I have responsibilities for it. And you actually learn to appreciate the value of formal rules very quickly, especially for organizations that are starting out. So this has been a great learning experience for me, I have to say. So
should we head then? We all feel psychologically prepared? Okay. So I'll start out with a question that I'm going to ask, and I'll present to both of you. You can answer it in whatever order it appeals. The first one involves actually both sides of the board. Let's say, hypothetical me, I have a great relationship with some of the board members at my organization, and I'm also involved with another organization. I'm on the board of that organization. Is it okay for me to contact the board members at the institution where I work for activities that might relate to the organization where I'm a volunteer and a board member? For example, could I arrange a collections visit? Could I put them in touch with somebody else at the organization where I'm a volunteer that might eventually lead to a development ask? Or is that not ethical? Either one of you want to take that one on?
I mean, I think the world is really small, and often, paths cross. So I think as long as you say, I'm calling you wearing this hat, not the other hat, this hat, and I thought it would be interesting for such and such reason, and leave it up to them, I think it's perfectly acceptable, and I've done such things.
Mm-hmm. And I have too. I seem to be a little bit flat-footed in this regard, that I sort of sometimes ask those things up front. There's one person in particular that just seemed to be getting hit on all the time, has a private life. I was very worried about that. And so it was just a quick phone call to say, look, I get these calls all the time. And this is a little bit different from the question you asked, but how do you feel about that? Is it okay with you? I'm involved in this and so organization. I'm, as Deb said, I'm wearing a different hat. How do you feel about that? And just let them sort of take the lead on that. How they would wish for you to either approach them or not approach them. There are a lot of people who would welcome that, be flattered by it, want to help out. There are others who just feel like I've had it up to here. You know, I've given as much as I can. I don't want to take anything else on, and both responses are fine.
Do you owe it to the director? This is a follow-up question. Do you owe it to the director of your employing institution that to tell them that you're approaching someone on behalf of another organization? Is that good protocol?
I think it is good protocol, but it depends on what it is. If it's something that's really small and not, you know, I'm not going to waste his or her time with that. If it's one where I think it could conceivably have a negative impact for the museum, by all means, I would run it by the director. I tend to do over than under.
Mm-hmm. Better safe than sorry.
Better safe. Exactly. Okay, next question, just to take a slightly different tack. I'm interacting with a board member, maybe in a more informal context, and they ask me if I'm happy with my job or my boss or my salary. Is it appropriate to discuss compensation and job satisfaction with board members?
You know, I frankly never have. And I think most of the trustees with whom I've worked know not to ask that question, because it's I mean, I'm going to be really interested to hear other people's responses to this. You know, with a question like that, I think the appropriate answer is, you know, you might want to talk to the director about that, or the committee that's charged with employee compensation, because really there's a better way to get that information without putting you, the curator, director, whatever, in an incredibly awkward position in which the negative impact could be, you know, kind of outweighs the kind of honesty that you might want to have with that particular person. And actually, one trustee who was a good friend before she became a trustee, we've never had that conversation with one another, ever. And I think that if she were interested in that question, there are other places to go for that, other committees at the museum or the director. But again, remember, I've been part of a really large, complicated institution where I may be more observant about protocol than may be necessary. So, Deb, what are your thoughts?
I haven't been asked about my director, and that would feel very, very inappropriate to me, and I probably would say this feels uncomfortable, or deflect it somehow, however I could at the moment. I have been asked about compensation for myself and my staff in the curatorial department at El Museo, and I have used it as an opportunity to say, have you looked at the AAMD salary survey for this year? We are paying in the low ranks, which makes it hard to recruit people. You know, I've used it as a teaching moment.
And I should jump in and say I've done that too.
Without actually saying, you know, I'm happy or I could make more if I left or anything like that. You know, without just saying, you know, it could be, you know, working against us.
And just a note to all AAMC members, one of your perks, or one of your benefits, I should say, is that about 3 weeks ago we did send out the salary survey. That was based on the findings of the AAMD, and that's for members only. So do check that. I have used it. I've also used AAM's, and I have used those statistics to say this is where we stand in order to get raises for people in a different part of the museum that were severely underpaid within the median range. So use those metrics. Use those resources that you have, because that speaks louder than words, really.
Great. And as we're continuing the lightning round, I did want to point out to everybody who's all the attendees, if you have another perspective on some of the questions we're asking, or especially if you have questions you'd like us to present to the moderators, you can start typing those in now, because we reserved a section of time at the end for those questions. So please feel free to type those in at any time. Situational question. One of our board members is an artist, though of somewhat minor standing. He has given many generous gifts of the museum from his extensive collection, not of his own making, and now he would like to give a work that he made himself. Of course, we don't want to offend him, Is it ethical to accept this donation?
Deb, I think since you work more with living artists than I do, I do think you'd be the best person. So I'm punting.
And I have to grab my plug because my computer's about to run out of battery. It's very awkward. You have to see, that's when you use your committee. I mean, you have to write up the offer like you would any other one. And in this case, you could say, since it's a person on our board or on our committee, there's obviously potentially some kind of a conflict here, but this is the resume, this is, the work that they do, and, this is the possible relevance to the relationship to our collection.
And then if
hopefully the committee can help you resolve that.
And there must be... Go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
No. I was just going to say for those, as I said, Deb works a lot with living artists, so I don't feel like I can. What I can say is that, and she needs to get a plug, so I'll just go ahead and say that I have worked with trustees where they want to give a gift that's not quite up to par for the collection, and that again, and they've been incredibly generous donors, so on and so forth. And I think that that's where you do your due diligence. Let's say it's an A- picture by a B- artist. I'm just using that as a rule. Just an example. You kind of do, take it seriously, do your research, see how it would fit or not fit in the collection, and then provide that kind of information to the director as well as your committee. And I have to say, in most cases in the past, I felt like because the work didn't have a condition issue, it didn't have a storage issue, it didn't have a long-term conservation issue that we had to be concerned about, but in those instances, since it wasn't a terrible thing, and because it was a known artist with a known exhibition record, and if there were no requirements that, or expectations, I should say, that it would be on view all the time, in most cases we accepted it with gratitude. And I say that because this person had already given, some cornerstone pictures for the collection, and you want to keep that relationship going. If it's something where you feel so strongly about, then that's where, again, you also want to be working with your director and your committee. And it sort of going back to what Miranda said, these rules of governance and so forth, this is where they really help you. There's a reason that those processes are in place. They work.
Okay, next question. And this, I feel like I run into fairly regularly. Is it ethical for a board member to pay for my lunch or dinner? What if they buy gifts? Am I required to buy them gifts? And if so, what do you give a board member?
I had advice. I'll go ahead and take that one first, and just say that I had great advice from a former director who said, trustees, when you're having lunch with them, dinner, whatever, they're generally going to want to pick up the tab. Just make sure you do it every now and then so that they don't always feel like they're just the cash cow for the institution. I mean, I think you have to use common sense. If you're meeting with your trustee, generally you're talking about art, you're talking about acquisitions, you're talking about the museum. It is a business lunch or a business dinner, and I never had any problem with their picking up the tab, but I always offered to do it the next time and did do it the next time, and sometimes you kind of have to fight over the check. But I had at least 3 of them well trained to know that, it was kind of an every other sort of thing. And obvious, another thing too, knowing that as curators, it's not a job that is particularly well paid, it's perfectly fine to extend the gesture. I did this quite often. I would say, how would you like to come to the museum? I'll bring in the box lunches, and then we can spend some time looking at this painting or, whatever, because that was kind of an easier way to reciprocate, and it was a little bit easier on the budget. as far as gifts go, I mean, I don't think there's any rule of thumb. I mean, obviously, if it's something that you feel uncomfortable about, i.e. it's too generous, that's something to take up, I think, with your director. In terms of gift giving, I think it's perfectly fine to send a holiday card, although I have to confess I haven't done it in a really long time, and I'm embarrassed about that. I tend to not be a particularly, there's some people who are really good at that kind of thing. I don't happen to be one, but I am pretty good if I come across a book or something and it reminds me of somebody, I might pick that up and send it. And it would have nothing to do with a birthday or a holiday. And frankly, I don't think trustees, Deb, I'd be curious to know what you think. I don't really think they expect gifts. I think they're delighted when they receive a card. I know they're delighted when they receive a handwritten note at any time of year, regardless of the holiday. And I don't think there, at least in my experience, that there have been those expectations for gifts or big gifts. And sometimes I've made things, I like to cook, so sometimes I'll, make something that I think might be special for that person that's homemade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never received a gift that's made me uncomfortable. Sometimes somebody's taken me to something or a play, or certainly they've picked up a tab for dinner or drinks many more times than I have. But like Emily said, I tried to reciprocate occasionally at least. And I never really gave gifts. We sort of did that institutionally, at least at El Museo, to our board. And I would send cards sometimes to my favorite ones or invitations to other things, like let's go to this together, and that was sort of the special things that I did.
Okay.
I'm not getting any questions from the audience, so I'm going to continue. We have many, many more of these situational questions that I can go on with, and you guys are doing great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let me see. A board member seems to be violating terms of membership. For example, exploiting confidential acquisition information for personal gain and competitive collecting. To whom do I report this? What can I do to help the institution resolve the issue?
I would go to my director. I would go to my director and discuss it in depth with them, and hopefully they would handle it, or that we would make a strategy to handle it together. I think, or my development director, or whoever was the appropriate, but nearly always my director. In my case, because I worked at a small institution, so we were in and out of each other's office all the time. But I would go to the appropriate department head as the director and let them know, which usually it was either development or, because I've seen that happen.
Yeah, I've experienced it as well, and it's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Yeah.
But you have to communicate it to the appropriate person. In my case, it was the director, and hope that it becomes some kind of learning opportunity for all sides. I mean, it depends on your institution. I mean, in the cases where it happened with me, it was a couple of cases where, it was a very fine collector, perhaps not as experienced as, I'm kind of thinking of some of the boards that our members might have in New York, where you're dealing with some, generational collectors. This is in the DNA. They know what they're doing. That's a slightly different situation. So again, you have to do it case by case basis. In my experience, it was something that the director handled by turning it into a learning opportunity for everybody. A reminder at a collections committee meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to remind everybody that what we discuss in this room is confidential.
Right.
And even though we send these binders to you ahead of time with this information, this is for you and your eyes only. Just want to remind everybody of that, because this is not good for the institution, and that is your, that's what you're here for if it's used in a different way, so that you don't have to sort of call out people by name.
Okay. My next question, since I think Jennifer and I are going to continue asking questions for a bit. It's actually not so much a situational question as a topic, Emily, that you and I discussed in preparation, which is the issue of gender. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about how gender dynamics might affect interactions with the board. in whatever direction you want to take that.
Well, I would say that I've had experiences in two different extremes, and I know that I'm making, Houston seem like the most enlightened place on the planet, but in fact it was, it really is a great institution, and not once, and this is a Texas institution with all the stereotypes that come with that, not once did I ever with any trustee, any member of staff, anybody feel as a woman that I was in a boys club, or that I was being discriminated against, or that I was made to somehow feel like a lesser being. And I know that seems, crazy, because there are very few places like that, but in fact it was that way. And I'm very grateful that I had that kind of experience. I've also been on the other side, where it is a very male-dominated situation, a boys' club in which the decisions are made in the men's restroom, and that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. And what you hope happens is that in time the culture obviously changes, and you can play a role in that. I'm too old now to ever feel uncomfortable, but early on in my career, there were times when, because there were a lot of men who were involved in my particular, or a fair number on my subcommittee, that sometimes being in a public place one-on-one, if you're a young woman, that might feel uncomfortable if you're in a place that is as social, so to speak, as Houston can be. And I guess I would just, I do think that whatever people feel about Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, she has a really great chapter about how when she was working with Larry's son, and they were in a hotel room, both of them, till 3 o'clock in the morning, working on some sort of strategic document that they had to present the next morning. And that there was a moment when she left the room, the hotel room, looking up and down the hallway to see if anyone was looking. And of course, realizing that if something someone had seen her, that it is the nature of the beast at this time and place in our country, that she would be the one who was, accused, vilified, whatever. So I do think you have to be sensitive about those potential situations. But again, I think they're case-by-case basis, which of course is not terribly helpful to those at a virtual world. But again, it's something that you might be able, if you do feel uncomfortable, to just get some feedback from your director or your director of development. Or other women who are in leadership positions at the institution. Deb, have you ever encountered this?
The arts organizations that I've been involved with were so much about diversity in a certain way that wasn't so much of an issue for me at the prior organizations. Ironically, I spent the whole first year that I was at Columbia revising there were no bylaws for our advisory committee. And trying to reflect the fact that we need to have diversity on the committee, which seemed to be the first time that was ever thought about at Columbia. So, having to introduce the idea, and, just some gentle reminders like, certain foundations and grants that you go for, ask, report out on that. And it's not, of course we want that for good balance and for good conversation and for a well-rounded perspective, but, there's often an obligation to do so for funding. So bringing all that up, I find myself in the odd position of having to do that now.
Well, and I have too, and I have made assumptions where I shouldn't, because, and I know I'm making it sound like it was a Pollyanna experience. It certainly isn't. But given that many, 2 decades at an institution that was founded by women suffragettes, it just wasn't an issue. And you realize very quickly, you step outside of that, do not make assumptions that other places share that same kind of gender equality, because that is not necessarily the case.
We have a question from our audience, and I will read this to you. Very good one. Is it a conflict of interest to serve on an advisory board for a museum that is similar in mission and collection to my own? For instance, if I'm a senior curator at a university museum and I'm invited to join the board for the university museum at my alma mater, which is in a different city from my home institution.
it would seem to me likely that you would be invited to be on boards that were in your area of expertise, especially given that it's in another city. I think I don't see that as any conflict.
I don't see it as a conflict either, and I think that as long, again, just sharing that information with your director, that I intend to join this board, I want to run it by you. Again, as Deb said, you're not going to on a museum that has nothing to do with your field, because what would you be bringing to the table? And I think as long as you make it clear in serving on your alma mater's institution that you would have to recuse yourself or leave the room with something that was something that was discussed that in some way felt like a conflict of interest, that you would need to be at liberty to do so. And I'm sure that they would say, of course, we would want you to do that. But I think it's to the benefit of the institution that you serve in most cases to be on that board of your alma mater's university art museum. So I don't see it as a conflict of interest as long as the terms are clear.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. So I'll ask another question. Just to keep going. This question sort of relates to a case. I think one thing that seems very clear from our discussion is the importance of relationship with the director, and the ability to always go to the director if there's a problem with the board members. One question I have sort of deals with a case where, what if you feel like you can't go to the director, or if you're in a situation where a board member is telling you something critical about the director? Obviously, you don't want to be in a compromising position. Do you have any suggestions of how to handle their critiques diplomatically, or basically how do you deflect that?
I really don't invite those kinds of conversations. I deflect. I might say politely, "Oh, I hear what you're saying, but remember, there's a chain of authority, and that person is my boss, and so it's really impossible for me to comment. I would suggest you take that concern to XYZ, get the chair of the board, maybe a certain committee, maybe they have a friend on the board that they could share that concern with, but really bringing it to a staff member is really not professional."
Yeah, and I have said before, what you're saying is making me uncomfortable because they're my supervisor, and I'm not in a position to act on the information you're providing. So you need to talk to your other board members or the director themselves, or deflect it.
Great. Well, we're winding down. We're getting to the end of our time now. So I just wanted to throw it out to both of you and Miranda, if you had any final comments, if there are things we didn't touch on, or if you have any final advice for people, whether it's becoming a board member or dealing with the board at your own institution. Emily, or did you want to?
Well, I would just say that I wish that I had had this webinar and Miranda's, PowerPoint when I first started, because that was the kind of, this was back when the internet wasn't even a gleam in Al Gore's eye. We didn't really have that kind of access to great information, and so I kind of learned on the job. I was very lucky to be part of an institution where what I was learning was precisely what I think I should have been learning in a very positive kind of way. But short of being a nuisance, I just really, embrace your board. It's a two-way street, and I have found that while you're spending a lot of time with your board members, it's always time well spent, because on one hand, you're sharing with them, even when you're not recognizing it, why art matters, why it's important. Why does Edward Hopper matter at the end of the day? And they appreciate that so much, because they're volunteering. They're doing this because they love art. They may not know a lot about it, or they want to support the community. So they love what they're learning from you. And I would just say, I have learned almost as much from other trustees that I've worked with than I've learned from professors in graduate school. And it happened even most recently on Friday. I mentioned the trustee with whom I had breakfast with his wife. He just we were talking about a particular problem, and he said, well, in my business world, this is how I would handle that problem. You know, there are lots of conversations like that that I think are enriching for both sides. So instead of thinking about board relations as a one-way street, it's really a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would echo what Emily said. I mean, for me, it's been, you know, part of my professional development and experience serving on boards, small boards, and larger boards, to learn how things get done and to see it from the perspective of the responsible party for an arts organization, as opposed to someone who's working in the arts organization. And at the same time, the board that I've had the most close interaction with, there have been challenging and difficult members, but as much there's been members that have become good friends of mine that, you know, that they've left and I've left and we're still in touch, and they're still very, very helpful to me in ways, you know, that I hope that I can reciprocate as best I can. So, you know, I said earlier, the world is small, and if you're in your field and there are people who are in your field, you're gonna keep running into them. So to me, it's been mostly a very, very good experience, and I've made some really good friends with co-board members. So that's been very enriching, working together for the benefit of an organization.
And I don't want to have the last word. I just want to say what I forgot to say was also that there's a combination of being very serious about what you do, and but doing it sort of with a light touch. And I think the more that you can do that with the trustees with whom you work, it's just going to be a blast. It's going to be fun for everybody involved.
Right.
I guess, so if I could say maybe 3 points that I've taken away from this discussion. One is that it is helpful to have some degree of separation from board members where discussions can be fruitful, engaging, but I feel like you've both sort of talked about how there has to be some degree of, I believe Emily used the term business friendship, which sort of stresses the professional nature ultimately of the relationship, and that is in everyone's benefit. The second point being that there is a reason for chain of command in this sort of thing, and you both sort of stressed the importance of involving the director, of using protocol with the board. And thirdly, something that I found very helpful is the point that you both mentioned about how when dealing with the board, you're not alone. You should lean on your colleagues, you should lean on the support of your institution, so that it never feels like, you know, you're off at sea with a board member that you can't handle. You know, I found that those were 3 things that I took away.
Great. I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you very much for participating, all of you. It was informative for me. It was really informative, and I'm glad to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.